You believe something painful about yourself right now. You may believe you are not good enough, that you always ruin things, that other people have something you will never have. You have believed it for so long that it no longer feels like a belief. It feels like a fact. But here is the question nobody thinks to ask. When did you actually examine it? Not think about it, not ruminate on it, not argue about it with yourself at 2 in the morning. When did you sit down and genuinely question whether it is true? There is a method for doing exactly that. It is 2,500 years old, and it turns out to be one of the most effective psychological tools ever discovered. By the end of this video, you will have a powerful tool that will help you start to rid yourself of all your unseen mental and emotional obstacles that keep you from gaining clarity about that ingrained perspectives and beliefs that you carry around needlessly. Socrates did not write anything down. Everything we know about him comes from his students, particularly Plato, who recorded his conversations in a series of dialogues that have shaped Western thought ever since. Socrates wandered the marketplaces of ancient Athens asking questions, not to humiliate, not to win, but because he genuinely believed that the unexamined life was not worth living and that most people were walking through their existence with unquestioned assumptions running silently in the background, shaping every choice they made without their awareness. His method was simple in structure and demanding in practice. He would take a belief someone held with confidence and ask them to define it clearly. Then he would ask what followed from that definition. Then he would introduce a case or experience that complicated it. Then he would ask what that meant for the original belief. The conversation did not end with a tidy answer. It ended with the person understanding their own thinking more deeply than they had before. Sometimes that was unsettling. More often, it was quietly liberating. This is what Socratic questioning actually is. Not aggressive debate, not intellectual point scoring. Disciplined, curious, compassionate examination of the beliefs you are already carrying. For most of the centuries that followed Socrates, this method lived in philosophy seminars and law schools. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, 2 psychologists looked at it and recognized something extraordinary. Beck was a psychiatrist working with depressed patients in the 1960s. He began to notice that his patients were not simply sad, they were thinking in highly specific, distorted patterns. They were catastrophizing, they were overgeneralizing, they were filtering every experience through a fixed negative lens, discarding evidence that contradicted it and holding on to everything that confirmed it. Beck called these automatic negative thoughts, and he developed cognitive behavioral therapy around the idea that changing the thought could change the feeling. Ellis, working around the same time, developed rational emotive behavior therapy built on a similar foundation. Both men independently arrived at the same technique for helping patients challenge their distorted thinking. It was Socratic dialogue. Ask the patient what they believe. Ask what evidence supports it. Ask whether there's evidence against it. Ask what they would say to a friend who held the same belief. Ask what is the most realistic outcome. Ask what it would mean if the belief were partially true rather than completely true. The method Socrates used in the Agora to examine the nature of justice and beauty turned out to be the same method that could interrupt a shame spiral in a therapy room 2.5 centuries later. This is not a coincidence. It reflects something deep about how the mind works. Most of the beliefs cause you psychological distress are not the result of careful reasoning. They are the result of experience. Pain teaches fast. A childhood in which love felt conditional teaches you that you must earn approval. A relationship that ended in rejection teaches you that closeness leads to abandonment. A series of failures teaches you that effort is pointless. These conclusions feel like evidence. They feel like wisdom earned the hard way, but they were formed quickly, under emotional pressure, without examination, and they have been quietly running your behavior ever since, and running you down. Socratic questioning gives you a way back in. There are 6 broad categories of Socratic questions, and each one targets a different layer of unhelpful thinking. The first category is clarifying questions. What exactly do you mean when you say that? Can you say it more precisely? This matters because vague, painful beliefs are harder to examine than specific ones. I am a failure is almost impossible to challenge because it refers to everything and nothing. I failed to handle that situation the way I wanted to is something you can actually look at. Precision does not minimize the pain, it makes the pain workable. The second category is questions about evidence. What makes you believe this is true? What would you need to see to change your mind? Is there anything that contradicts it even slightly? Most automatic negative thoughts survive because they selectively gather supporting evidence and ignore everything else. A single Socratic question about counter-evidence can crack that filter open. The third category is questions about assumptions. What are you taking for granted here? Are you assuming that your interpretation is the only possible one? Are you assuming that what happened once will always happen again? Assumptions are the load-bearing walls of a distorted belief system. Identifying them does not automatically collapse the structure, but it lets you see what is holding it up and whether it deserves to be there. The fourth category is questions about perspective. How would someone else see this situation? What would you say to a close friend who came to you holding this exact belief? Is this standard you would apply to other people or only to yourself? The perspective question is particularly powerful because the inner critic almost never applies its standards consistently. You would rarely speak to someone you loved the way you speak to yourself at your lowest moments. The fifth category is questions about implications. If this belief were true, what would follow? Is that conclusion actually as catastrophic as it feels right now? And if it were partially true rather than completely true, would that change how you see it? Catastrophizing collapses the distance between a setback and a disaster. Implication questions restore that distance and allow you to see a range of possible outcomes rather than only the worst one. The sixth category is questions about the question itself. Why does this matter to you so much? What does it mean that this thought keeps returning? Is there something you are trying to protect by holding this belief? Sometimes the belief is not the real thing. Sometimes a person clings to a painful belief about their own inadequacy because it feels safer than the alternative, which is to try in full, to risk genuinely, and to face real possibility of failure rather than assumed failure. The painful belief functions as a kind of insurance policy against hope. Questioning it can feel threatening precisely because it opens up the possibility of something better. None of this is quick. That is worth saying directly. Socratic questioning is not a 5-minute technique. It is a practice. And like most practices, it takes repetition before it becomes natural. The first few times you try to question a deeply held belief, the belief will push back. It will produce more evidence for its own truth. It will make the questioning feel arrogant or pointless or naive. This is normal. A belief that has organized your behavior for years does not dissolve under one round of examination, but it can begin to loosen. There's also a way to do it badly, and this distinction is important. Rumination looks like self-questioning. It uses the same vocabulary, it returns to the same painful territory again and again. But rumination is not Socratic questioning. Rumination circles. It asks, "Why am I like this?" without genuinely expecting an answer, and then uses the unanswered question as further evidence of hopelessness. Socratic questioning moves. It takes a belief, examines it from multiple angles, and arrives somewhere different from where it began. If you find yourself asking the same question about yourself and arriving at the same painful conclusion every time, that is not inquiry. That is a thought loop wearing the costume of inquiry. The difference lies in the quality of attention. Socratic questioning is genuinely curious. It approaches a belief the way a scientist approaches a hypothesis, not trying to confirm it and not trying to destroy it, but trying to understand whether it holds up. This requires a degree of psychological distance from the belief, which is itself a skill. Some people find journaling helpful because writing a belief down creates that small but significant gap between the thought and the thinker. Others find it easier in conversation with someone they trust or in the structured environment of therapy, where a skilled practitioner can model the questioning when doing it alone feels too difficult or too close. And in the world most of us currently inhabit, doing it alone is harder than it has ever been. The information environment is built to confirm rather than question. Algorithms learn what you believe and show you more of it. Social feeds amplify the ideas your group already holds. Outrage travels faster than nuance, and certainty performs better than honest uncertainty. The capacity to sit with a belief and ask whether it is factually true without rushing toward a conclusion, without reaching for immediate reassurance, without checking what other people think before you have thought for yourself, is a form of cognitive discipline that requires deliberate effort in a world designed to bypass it. Socrates was eventually put on trial and executed for asking inconvenient questions. The jury found his habit of examining public certainties threatening enough to warrant a death sentence. That detail has always said more about the deep human discomfort with self-examination than it has about Socrates himself. Genuine inquiry is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be. The discomfort is the friction of a belief being tested rather than merely repeated, and that friction is where understanding lives. Here is how to begin. Take one painful belief you currently hold about yourself. Write it down in one clear sentence. Then ask what evidence exists that it is true. Write down whatever comes to mind without editing it. Then, ask what evidence exists that it is not entirely true, or that the situation is more complicated than the belief suggests. Write that down too. Then, ask what you would say to someone you care about if they came to you holding the same belief. Notice the tone of that answer. Notice how different it is from the tone you use with yourself. Finally, ask what a more accurate and more complete version of the belief might look like, one that accounts for the evidence on both sides rather than only the evidence that pain selected. You are not trying to replace a negative belief with a positive one. Forced positivity is just another form of unexamined thinking. You are trying to arrive at something more precise, something that has been questioned, something that belongs to your actual experience rather than a conclusion that was handed to you by an old hurt and never reviewed. Socrates believed that wisdom begins not with answers, but with the recognition of your own uncertainty, not as a humiliation, but as an opening. The moment you genuinely admit that you might be wrong about something you have always taken for granted, you create the possibility of seeing it differently. That possibility is small at first, but it is real, and it is yours. You began this with a belief about yourself that felt like a fact. Perhaps it still does, but now you have a question to ask it. And that question, followed with genuine curiosity rather than fear, may take you somewhere that avoidance, reassurance, and repetition never could. The examined life is not a philosophical luxury. It is the most practical thing your mind can learn to do.